who are prepared to testify to their own experience. That's extremely valuable. In some ways, it may be more valuable than merely a noise in Parliament. What's important, however, is to see we can't bring about governmental change. The fact is that the big debate, as it were, is between those who say that Article 25 of the Constitution guarantees everyone the right to practice their faith, and therefore challenging any aspect of the practice of the faith is wrong, and those who would argue that even the freedom of religion is subject to the fundamental rights of every citizen under Part 3 of the Constitution. And therefore, the importance of stressing that the woman's right to bodily integrity, as well as a right to her own dignity, supersedes the right to religious practice in Article 25. That would be the challenging debate to be had in Parliament. It may be, as in many other issues of social practice in our country, it may be that in the end it will only get resolved in the courts. Because we've seen with 377, for example, the horrendous resistance in Parliament to even discussing it. I was not even allowed to introduce my bill, let alone losing a debate on the merits.
We started a Let's Talk About 377 today in HT.
Good, good. So the logic, and you've obviously, this issue is one in which very clearly we have a vast area of ignorance and unawareness. There is always the political perception that it'll be targeting a single community, and that therefore it'll play into the agendas of those who have a communal agenda, to which I think it's important to stress, certainly for myself, that I am not against any community, but that while I strongly agree that the law cannot and should not regulate any individual's beliefs or systems of worship, which are essentially between that person and his or her idea of the divine, of God, the law can and must regulate the actions of individuals in our society when they impact other people. So whether your action is motivated by religious belief or whether it's motivated by anything else, the moment you impact somebody else, you can't do it anymore. And my argument applies whether it's to people who are attacking human beings in the name of protecting the cow, or it's people who are attacking human beings in the name of upholding a religious tradition. And that is something which I believe we should stress here. Now, I was glad to hear you were able to meet Maneka Gandhi, because obviously this falls squarely within her ministry. And if she is in a position to propose a standalone legislation to regulate this practice, then the problem is over. But it's not so much a parliamentary debate that will bring it about. It is a decision within the relevant ministry, then its submission to and approval by the cabinet, and then being brought to Parliament, whereupon then we can have a meaningful debate.
But you could raise the issue in Parliament, create awareness. A lot of people don't even know that FGM is practiced in India. So
one way of raising it, as I said, is to something like 0R. The problem with that, as I know from personal experience, is that 300 people will put in 0R requests, a lottery is held. It's also the number of slots are proportionately allocated to parties. My party doesn't often get too many of these things through. So out of every dozen topics I try to raise under that kind of formula, I may get one if I'm lucky in one session. And inevitably, and you have to understand the challenge for an MP, inevitably what the constituency is looking for is for the MP to speak on matters that directly concern them and impact their lives. This is a very important issue of national principle. In any broader debate, I'd be very happy to volunteer to speak for it, as I have agreed to come and add my voice today to the discussion. But unless this issue comes up, at the very least in a broader discussion on women's rights, or a broader discussion on sexual abuse, or a broader discussion on freedom of religion versus society, unless there is a debate in which this issue can be raised, trying to raise it so motu through something like trying the lottery of 0R, frankly doesn't have enough impact on moving the issue forward.
You're very powerful with your words, Shashi. You could write
and that's why I'm trying to use my words right here.
You could write an article on this.
Well, I'll certainly issue a tweet after this, for one thing. I don't feel qualified or competent to write a full article because I have obviously not been part of the narrative of pain that so many women have experienced. But as somebody who cares about the Constitution, cares about liberal values in our society, cares about the freedoms enshrined in the Constitution, cares about human rights, I do have a view and I will express it very firmly. I should, of course, stress that as far as our obligations to the UN are concerned, the UN has consistently taken a zero-tolerance stand on FGM, even though there are many African countries that have advanced similar arguments, saying that this is their tradition. The UN and the General Assembly and the UN Secretariat have been consistently open on this, and I think we should begin to develop a climate of opinion that ends up in the same place here in India, including, of course, through your work in the media.
I was going to ask you about the United Nations. You know, you've had a very long stint there as an envoy in the United Nations. The UN bans female genital mutilation, so India can do much more because they are part of, the United Nations. But do you think the UN has not done enough in terms of maybe telling India that, hey, look, you need to focus on this?
Well, the thing is, the UN is a collection of member states. So a collective position by all member states, the UN can reflect. Implementation of those decisions then is by individual member states, and the UN has no coercive power over them. Therefore, the best we can hope for is, if I were to sit here today and prescribe a way forward, it would be a combination of the things we're already doing. Number one, approach the government, get the relevant ministry to actually start drafting legislation. Offer to help them with a draft, which I'm sure you can do. And then, secondly, build up a climate of opinion that supports this. This can be done certainly through the mass media and also through specific support for an initiative if the government has the courage to take one. You know, they found triple talaq a very easy issue to plug, and they went all out for it. This one, will they show the same enthusiasm? It remains to be seen. But I do believe it's important because we're talking, as I said, about human rights, and we're not talking, in my view, against the rights of any particular community or of religious worship.
It's quite sad, isn't it, that the so-called honor of men is defined by a woman's body.
Always.
Including a...
Padmavat is the same story. It's always the men who are declaiming about their honor, and it's somehow always over the woman's body that the battle is fought.
Without paying attention to the suffering that women go through. So we have today a qualitative study that actually gives us numbers on how prevalent this practice is within the Bohra community. Before you release that report, I'd like Lakshmi and Shabana to tell us a little more about the study and what it brings out.
Yeah. So,
number of younger girls and younger women who are against cuffs compared to the other sample. Yeah.
And one last point to be made, it seems to me, is how much of this is women doing it to other women. I mean, you know, the ones who are giving the social pressure, the ones who are conducting the operation, the ones who are suffering it, the ones who are then trying to console the child, bring her up, all these are women. I mean, it's no?
we would like to.
And who you mentioned triple talaq and the government not being as enthusiastic as it is. Do you sense some amount of double speak on behalf of the government on the two issues?
Yeah, I mean, the fact is that I think if the Women and Child Development Ministry came up with a draft bill, the Minorities Ministry would have to be consulted. Indeed, the Law Ministry would have to be consulted too. But that's the normal process. Who should initiate it, since it's clearly an issue of women's welfare? And I think should not be seen specifically as a minority issue. It's an issue of human rights and of the rights of women. I would still think the locus lies on WCD, and that's why I'm very pleased that that Menaka ji did grant an appointment to the people at the podium here to make this case, and presumably she has a copy of the report, or it will be sent to her.
Yeah,
I think it's very important that the Women and Child Development Ministry initiate it. Secondly, there is a certain paradox in this, right? I mean, triple talaq is kind of a safe kind of issue because nobody in their right minds can actually defend it. In fact, most Islamic Maulvis say that it's an un-Islamic practice, that it's something which is a distortion of the faith and so on. And therefore, in a sense, they can score political points in the government by pushing it. Our only reason for asking it to be referred to committee is because we were unsure about the wisdom and the precedent being set in criminalizing a civil offense. And secondly, we were also confused by the fact that on the one hand, the woman doesn't want to be instantly divorced because she needs the support and the family to be held together. And then you want to throw the husband in jail. How is he going to support her from jail? So there seemed to be a couple of issues that had not been thought through. So we said, why don't we have a discussion in committee? And then no one in the Congress party saying triple talaq is a good thing. Far from it. But then, with further discussion, a formula could have been found. Our concern is also that behind some of these bills lies a political agenda, that sometimes an unnecessary bill can be made an issue of in order to score a particular political point against a community broadly defined. Whereas in this particular case, it's a specific wrong done within a specific community and to a specific group of people, which makes it politically, of course, a little more challenging for a government to take up. And that's why I was at pains to stress that it should not be seen in that light. It should be seen specifically as a human rights issue involving the rights and dignity of Indian women. And it doesn't matter to me which community is doing it. It could have been a Hindu Adivasi tribe for all I care, and I would have felt the same way. My point is that rather than look at it as a potential political pawn in a communal agenda, that we should be looking at it purely as a human rights matter. And I would de-emphasize the communal issue as much as I could. Certainly, if I were to speak on this issue in Parliament, the points I would be making would be general, and as I said, they would be as applicable to somebody who claims that his religion obliges him to protect a cow at the expense of a human life, as it would be to saying that no religion should have the right to inflict pain and suffering, and indeed permanent scarring and damage on an Indian citizen who happens to be female. Yeah.
So, the center and Supreme Court has stressed that there is no evidence to show that this actually exists. Now, with this report before you, do you think it makes it difficult for the government to be dismissive about FGM at this time?
Correct. I think it does make it difficult to be dismissive. By the way, I mean, both the report and Harindra Baweja's article in the HT, right? Which laid out, I think, with the courage of these people, I was so impressed, specific names and quotes about their own experiences. The argument that there is no evidence seems to me to be, putting it bluntly, untenable. But I still feel that the judicial system may be, let's be very honest, a more likely source of a solution because judges don't need votes and politicians do. I mean, this is the blunt thing about whether it's 377, whether it's anything that is arguably indefensible under the constitutional ethos of our country, but at the same time is politically sensitive to certain groups of people. It's often the judiciary that is the last refuge. I think we've seen this on 377. If 377 is going to be got rid of, it'll be by the judiciary and not by the politicians, as we've seen from repeated performances in Parliament. Similarly with this, I do want both prongs to be tried, but I would certainly also repose some hope in a judicial intervention. I do believe that taking it to the government, going to the right minister was the right thing to do. If the minister brings it forward, we will try and offer bipartisan support where appropriate and where to the extent feasible. But at the end of the day, because the ultimate issue is a human rights issue, is a legal issue, the judiciary may turn out to be the best way forward. One more thing we haven't talked about is the National Human Rights Commission. Have you taken, you will take the report to them too?
Yeah.
That's very important because there is a flagrant violation of human rights taking place that the report documents. But you know, as I said, ultimately judges are less vulnerable to the political calculations that sometimes bedevil the most sincere attempts at social reform.
Hi, I'm Cindy from BBC, and as research study reveals that now educated people from Bohra community are approaching doctors in bore their daughters to Khatna. Can't
So that's a very interesting question, because as of now, there is no specific illegality that a doctor can be charged with. It's ironic, but there isn't. There is in other countries. In the US, it is illegal. In Britain, it is illegal. In India, it's not. But one of the interesting things, and now that she has raised this question, I was going to suggest is, in addition to going to the Human Rights Commission, why not go to the Medical Council of India? Why not go to the Indian Medical Association, which is an association of doctors, and say to them, can you, studying all this, send out a circular to your members disapproving of this practice? At the very least, you'll stimulate a debate within the medical community. And I think it's a very good point that after all, if indeed, and I think the authors of the report have pointed out that there is more and more resort to hospitalization. I mean, hospital cutting in the younger, medical cutting in the younger generation, then in that case, if you discourage doctors, you make doctors feel ashamed of doing it, it may become much less common.
And it's also a violation of medical ethics.
Well, you know, the thing is, there is an ethical code in the IMA, and I think in the MCI, but is this specifically mentioned?
Of not doing harm.
But then that's the old Hippocratic oath going back 2,000 years. Do no harm, but as you know, the advocates of this argue it is not harmful, it's actually good. I mean, there's this powerful quote in Harinder Baveja's article about a woman saying that the clitoral hood is the seat of haram. It is the seat of sin. And so from their point of view, you're not doing harm, you're actually preventing future harm. So do no harm is not enough. If it is specifically considered unethical, it'll go much farther. So at least stimulate this in the medical community. And you know, I think that when you are talking to doctors and saying, aren't you ashamed that some of you are actually practicing this act? You'll start a debate and perhaps even eventually a resolution that prohibits it.
There was even one more thing which I'd like to add. While talking to the doctors, we got to know from them that this is not something which is taught to them within their medical practice. I mean, as part of their education, this is not taught of how to cut. Like circumcision, male circumcision is something which is taught, but this is not a medically permissible or approved procedure.
Correct.
So whoever is doing it on their own risk and on their own knowledge. Yeah.
It's not part of medical syllabus, but we have written letters to the IMA and Medical Association. Unfortunately, we haven't got response, so we're going to take the report now to them. Seek a meeting with them. But the other, the flip part of it is that, you know, as in the US, we are seeing, because it's a crime and it's illegal, the practice is going underground, and then there's more pressure on it's going to the cutters, because doctors are saying, okay, we won't do it because we can be prosecuted. So it's going underground.
But as you know, the arrest of a cutter in America is what triggered off the latest wave of awareness.
Yes, I'd actually like to add a point
So what's
to that.
happening now, Shashi, is that because other countries are taking action, families are bringing their kids back to India to get it done because the practice continues here.
Yeah, that's precisely what I was trying to reach out. The two government bodies that I work with Change.org, Dr. Tharoor, and one of the first places that Masuma and her group spoke out was through a petition on Change.org where they said, we'd like a law to end FGM in India. Now, the biggest problem with POCSO or any other laws that might be useful for ending FGM in India is that there is no specific mention. There are laws which says grievous hurt, but beyond that, specific mention of FGM. And simply because it falls under the cultural practice purview, it becomes all the more difficult. But what's really happened, if you see globally, the kind of movements that have happened against FGM, you mentioned US rightly. Australia is the next country that's taking affirmative action, and very proactively so, which means one is going underground, but two, the community itself in India is issuing statements saying the Bora community in Australia, because the law of the land says this is criminal, cannot go forth with the practice. So there is a public stand that's being taken, and there comes the double standards in terms of when it comes to a country where there is a law which says this is criminal, then you can't practice it. But when it comes to India, where there is no law which says this is criminal, clearly it can be practiced openly.
I'm very glad you raised this point, because the Bora community rightly has a very good reputation across the world, and particularly in India, as a very constructive, socially open, shall we say, quote-unquote, well-behaved community that has never been a source of trouble. You don't hear about Bohra terrorists. You don't hear about, any of these things. One of their principles has always been, whichever country you're living, follow the laws and be good citizens. So in fact, that's what precisely makes this discussion so relevant, is the onus is on us more than on the Bohras. That's one of the reasons why I said, let us not see this as a communal issue. It is, to my mind, not a criticism of this admirable community. It is a criticism of us as a society, as a lawmaking body in the case of Parliament, as a judiciary, and in terms of general public opinion, that we haven't outlawed it. The day it is outlawed in India, it will stop in India too, because the Bohras will not want to break the law.
That's where the challenge lies, because the amount of government, the progress with government bodies that We Speak Out has managed to achieve through their campaigns is, one, they had the National Commission for Women, the ex-chairperson, Lalita Kumaramagalam, who supported them publicly on their campaign. And then Masuma was able to take it to the UNHRC as well this time. But beyond that, and then mid-last year, there was a significant statement from the Minister for Women and Child Development, who said that the Bohra community will have to step in and end this practice, failing which the government might have to intervene, right? After that, it's just been roadblock after roadblock. And in December, yes, and in December is where Jagriti was pointing out the affidavit in Supreme Court, which said there is no official record. Now the problem here is, where will the official records emerge from? Because it's all the family that's involved. So where will those women go out, where will they find the courage to file FIRs? They have found immense courage in starting a Change.org petition. For the first time, Masuma and around 18 other women put their stories out there, and it was terribly traumatic for them, because we were I remember where it started off. It was very, very traumatic for them to pen down their experience in that petition. Now, that petition has caught a lot of public imagination, and I must draw parallels to what's happening in countries like the UK and the US when it comes to public campaigns, because survivors similar to Masuma there in the UK and US have started similar Change.org campaigns. And if you see the kind of success or impact their petitions have had, or their campaigns have had, they have been able to get governments to commission studies on the extent of FGM in the US. They have been able to get the UK government to have a awareness curriculum in their schools on, in dealing with children who go back, because there are lots of children who come to the UK to study from African countries. So when the children go back, before their summer breaks is when this curriculum is being taught to them. So the amount of, the government will is what I would like to draw a parallel on. And that's sadly lacking in India. Can I just add one thing?